Hey everybody, welcome to the stream. Welcome to day 2 of this decentralized social media project called Citizen. I just dumped in the chat a link to the repo if you want to follow along. I documented a little bit about what we did 2 days ago on the first stream. Hey Febco, I'll tell you what technology we have considered the hypercore protocol, which is the team that I work on. So I got a bias right out of the gate. Gonna give everybody half a second to get into the stream, just tweeted about it and everything, and once we're ready to go, we'll got a little bit more to present here, talking about where we're headed on today's stream. But I'll start while people are coming in with a recap. So last time we put together it was a lot of yak shaving. We got our Node.js application started with Express, and so we got HTTP routes being served, step 1. We got our front end loading in, pulled a bunch of front end assets from a previous project I'd worked on in Beaker, where it's using, giving us a lot of our front end. That's all now building and looking good. And then we put together a JSON RPC API over WebSockets, got that handled. And then we started to work on our database system. And the data is being stored inside of the hypercore protocol using a key value, peer-to-peer key value databases. And so we basically, it's kind of like working with LevelDB, and we put into these databases, we separate them out. Every user has their own one of these databases, and then the server has 2 of them, one of them private, one of them public, and the public one aggregates users' posts and things like that. So you can see a quick rundown of that architecture on the README. That's what I documented there. And so today I want to talk first a little bit about how the whole network is going to function. As you all know, it's a peer-to-peer federated hybrid. So the individual users and the servers are all using peer-to-peer databases, but we're designing this so that rather than doing it in a pure peer-to-peer fashion, there's going to be servers involved that are giving us a couple of different things. They are helping form communities and moderate those communities. They're handling data aggregation for us. And they are keeping the data online, of course. And then, of course, they are giving us a web accessible way to get to the hypercore protocol, because Beaker does let you access it directly, but most web browsers don't. So that's why we're doing the hybrid. And some of the interesting questions that we'll be engaging with as we work on this project is how to set up those federated nodes such that even though they have kinds of authority for people over their content, they're doing moderation and things like that. How do we make sure that that works for everybody so that they're not getting a whole lot of power? For instance, if a node gets really big, you get into the same kind of situation that you get with existing social media, where the people that own the server are having a lot of control over what's going on. And a big part of what we're looking to do is create more authenticity in the entire system so that we feel like the moderation is reflecting what the user base wants. And part of how that is going to be made possible is by every user, first of all, having their own database so that in an ideal version of this, they would actually maintain the private key for it locally. And anytime they made a post, they would actually write it on their computer and then sync it up to the server, rather than having it the other way around, where the server's doing the hosting and users are. So in a way, the way that all of this has worked historically is you're sort of, the servers are maintaining your data for you and sort of lending to you the ability to make changes. And I'd like to invert that, where you have your own database and you're lending it to the server. And if that works correctly, it should mean we have very simple processes for people to move from one instance to another and take all their data with them, take all of their social relationships with them, and so on, and not be locked into any given instance. That would be our ideal. So let Let me just mention to somebody that I'm getting started here. And then I'm going to jump into this little presentation I got for us. So this is a sort of a little diagram of what our server topology would look like. You know, we have all the different servers in the federated system, each talking to each other, and each of them represents a community of users, right? And one of the interesting challenges is because we're using the servers to handle aggregation, there is still a bit of a kind of siloing effect which occurs with each server. If we were to only be looking at the data that the server is aggregating, it would tell you what this community is doing, but it wouldn't tell you anything about these. And so, of course, with the federated design, we have to think about how the application is going to be interacting with other nodes in the system. And there are lots of ways to do this, but what I'm going to outline is what I think we're going to do here. So let's say you have a post by somebody on this server over here, and 15 people on that server like it, so the like count says 15. So the interesting thing is, suppose these two other servers, their users have all liked it, 30 of them liked it on this server, 7 of them liked it over here. The question is, how are we going to pull this information over here so that somebody on this server sees what's going on in a wider sense of the world, and on other instances, how do we choose how to do that? And that kind of decision can have some pretty significant impact. Now, you could always have it where each server perhaps chooses to peer or synchronize with a list of servers that the admins choose. So then you're getting a wider net, but then you get a lot of power being put in that choice about who's being synced in those nodes. And there's some complications. Let's get into the different options here. One option is to have it kind of pushed into every individual user, this choice about which servers you're going to be talking to. So on my computer, I could say pull from server 1 and server 2, so I see that there's a total of 45 likes on it, but I'm going to ignore this server 3. I'm not interested in that community. And so that would be one way to aggregate the activity across multiple different nodes. Now that can work. It does leave you in a situation where everybody's computer is going to have to be talking to each of these servers anytime they want to find information. That can end up having some performance penalties that we have to grapple with. So I don't want to have to be sending one HTTP request from my own computer for every node that I'm interested in, for every server that I'm interested in, every community. So there's some downsides to that. Makes me think that's not the best option. Another option that we could take is, rather than thinking of it in terms of aggregating by server, instead we can have the users just following individual people as they will, but then doing the aggregation entirely locally. So this computer is following however many people from each of these communities and pulls together 12 likes out of all of them, because that is telling him, of the people I follow, who has liked this thing. There's two downsides to this. One of them is, of course, now you're having to make a whole lot of requests. You're having to do a whole lot of aggregation locally on your device to find out what activity is occurring. That's a lot. You generally prefer not to do that much local aggregation, especially because even if you're able to make it relatively efficient, you're still going to be having to query a whole lot of data and store a whole lot of data, and loading a page. You open up your feed, you're going to have spinners going for a while before you see anything. So it's not really a super ideal solution either. The other thing about that is that you're only seeing information or activity from people that you follow. Now, some people may prefer that. And of course, this is always an option for people to build their applications in the network like this. But generally speaking, from my experience, what's interesting about the social media experience is getting a sense of what's going on in a wider world. And so I would actually prefer to see activity if just things like likes from a larger community than just my own. So I don't personally love this approach either. So the thing to think about here is that each of these servers represents a community. So let's give them some random names. madscience.com, we'll say that's ours. There's cool.city and peeps.network. Okay. These are their kind of IDs. And the servers in our network, the way we should be thinking about them is that they are cultivating each of these communities. They're each going to be setting their own rules for moderation. They're going to be pulling in a culture of users based on who they invite in and who becomes active there. And so in a lot of ways, we can think of each of these servers as having a kind of identity and reputation of their own, where what becomes sort of interesting to look at is actually to look at the aggregated output of those servers and think of it as in terms of, oh, okay, so this is what the cool.city community thinks. They really like that post. They put 30 likes on it. Peeps.network, they were okay on it. They only had 7 likes on it, right? So letting the servers take a kind of identity like this gives us an interesting opportunity to bring more of an editorial viewpoint for each of the servers, and I hope provide a lot more clarity into what we're looking at when we're looking at these metrics. Like, there's 1,000 likes on this thing. Well, who are they? Is this a group of people that I respect and I'm interested in seeing what they think of this? Or is this a bunch of bots for all we know? Or just randos that I don't really vibe with? So by beginning to create an identity around these communities and attaching the different pieces of activity like like counts to these server identities, we start to get a more interesting perspective on what's going on in the network. And so we can imagine having UIs that maybe look like this, where you're looking at a post and getting a breakdown of the like count on each of the different communities. Now again, how we choose to aggregate that data, it's a tough call. As I step through, there are kind of 3 different options. Either the server chooses which communities, which other servers to automatically sync in and have ready for the end users to be looking at. Maybe it's an individual choice, but then you're having to send a whole lot more requests onto the network, and you may end up with performance problems. Because of the performance constraint, I'm somewhat more inclined to have the server make the choice, despite the fact that there's a lot of power in it, because a part of the mad science experiment here is actually actively exploring this question of governance of the server instances. And so when you're having a decision like which other instances do we peer with, I think that's one of the areas we could explore in terms of communities self-determining for themselves, deciding how to govern that choice for their server. Another example of this, and this is where this also I think gets interesting, is how you deal with trending. So, what's going on in the network? How are these algorithms working, right? And I think the interesting choice here is to break it down per instance, where each instance has some autonomy in deciding what their process is for saying what's trending on their instance. And then what they will do is produce a sort of a featured feed or a trending feed, which is drawn from their content. It's based on however they're choosing to do this. Maybe they say anything that hits 15% of the user base liking it, we stick it into our trending feed. Or maybe you do it somehow through another way where it's like you got 10 people acting as the quote-unquote editors of the instance, and if one of them gives it the thumbs up, it goes into the featured or the trending feed, something like that. It's really the way to think about it almost is that each of these servers is beginning to act like a publication or like a newspaper in a way, where they are presenting to the wider world through this featured feed or this trending feed the activity of their own community. And you get into a position where sort of the objective of participating in these communities is to have a voice in what gets put into this featured feed and to be sort of driving that community's output. So you are kind of a part of that community in a more meaningful way. You're there deciding what is getting published at the server level. So that will be probably handled by putting this featured feed, this trending feed, whatever we call it, putting that into the public database of every one of the servers. And so then whenever we're doing something along the lines of a trending view, what's going on in the world, we will be pulling from each of the servers' trending feeds to populate that database. And you might end up with a UI that kind of looks like this, perhaps, where you, in your feed, you got some post and it says across the top, trending on madscience.com. Right? So this is coming from that community, and here are the likes for each of the different communities that you have, that your instance is federating with. And that's just me trying to reflect that this is meant to help us give some sense of what the mad science community is talking about, what they think, what they're doing. So that's some high-level ideas about what we're going to be exploring with the Citizen project here, which is the name of this experiment. And it will probably evolve over time as we hit different challenges, but that's how we're going to start this thing. All right, hang on one second here. Don't really want to be sharing all that. Let me set up my screen now for doing some live code. Okay. So let's dig into this action. So when we left things off, we had our basic database design handled, and we were actually sort of in a situation of now beginning to look at how we're going to define our schemas. Again, check out the README if you're interested in getting a high level on how this is all architected. It's very minimal what I've documented, but it'll help get your feet under you. Jamie's saying it sounds like some tough technical challenges, and the UX challenges sound 1,000 times harder. The lucky thing is that we're coming at this from a place of having a lot kind of already handled for us. I've been messing with the hypercore technology and working on these kinds of projects for quite a while. So I think we're as well positioned to tackle this project as you could be. But you're right, it's going to be some interesting challenges ahead. Okay, so now to dive into the actual coding. Here was some of the debug code that we left, demonstrating that our database table system was in properly working order. And so yeah, it seems like now it's time to start thinking about the schemas and beginning to author those and basically start setting up our databases here. So let's start mapping these out. So we have a schema namespace that's going to be not actually at citizen.com, but something like that. So for now, we're just going to say citizen.com. So that's our namespace, and then we have the actual schemas. And so we got to decide here. If you're interested in catching up on the intro, I would actually suggest doing a playback, which is easy to do, and then you can rejoin us on the live. That way I don't have to keep on, telling the folks that were here the same thing. Sorry, I can't give you something more helpful than that, but... All right, so let's see here. Let's see. We're going to have, of course, some concept of a post. So there's going to be a post.json for this. This is mapping out our schemas, which is basically what I'm saying, mapping out our schemas. What I'm really saying is mapping out our tables. And let's separate these out by, we got the user database, we got the public server database, and we got the private server database. So definitely going to have the post on the user database. We're going to have a profile for sure. We're going to have votes. On replies, we can choose whether or not we want to have the replies be a different table or not. Let's see. I think actually probably yeah. Let's not do this Twitter style where it's all kind of homogenized. Let's instead differentiate between posts and comments. And hey, something for the stream to start. What are we going to call our posts? Can't call them tweets. But you need to have good branding on those things because people are going to say, hey, did you see my blank? And I think it's important we have a good word for that. Not to harsh on Mastodon, but we can't be doing anything like toot. I felt like that was, yeah, see, there we go, farts. Probably my favorite that we ever came up with is we made a Twitter clone at one point in Beaker called Fritter. And for those, they were called frets, which felt appropriate. So I'm fretting online. But the only thing I kind of have in my head is maybe pings. I don't know. We got to think about it. So chat if you got any ideas. All right, so we got posts, votes, comments. What else we got to think about here? I'm going to pull up my earlier presentation because I outlined a little bit of that. Always helpful to... Always helpful to pull from previous work here. So 1 second, let me pull that up. We know we're going to have a users table. And we know in the private database we're going to have an accounts table. Alright, let's see what else we got here. There's something we're going to have to do for media embeds, but I'm not quite ready to figure out how that's going to work. We got following to handle. Hypes. Since these are schemas, they should be singular because they're referring to the individual record. Okay, let's see here. So we're getting somewhere here. So now in the public server, it's going to be aggregating a lot of this information. And one of the interesting challenges we're going to have to think about here is how do we handle indexes in this design. One way to do it, of course, would be to have something which is like a JSON where, let's say this is a index of what's featured right now, our featured feed. And it could be something along the lines of something like that, right? Just a link to the actual post, and then the post would be over here, you know, like that. Apocalypse is asking, will users be able to delete their posts, or is it permanent? They will be able to delete their posts. And at minimum, we are going to be setting this thing up so that when you delete something, it just stops being cached in the history so that the federated nodes are not continuing to host those deleted posts. That's a really simple way to deal with this. And of course, if anybody else is hosting it, it'll be accessible. And that'll be something that we're just sort of contending with over time. There may be a future in which hypercores are able to be rebased to modify their histories, in which case you could completely excise any memory of a given post, but we're not there yet, and we're still waiting to find out what that looks like. So for now, we're going to just be forgetting things as opposed to trying to modify the history. Even more question is, will editing be allowed? I'm thinking yeah, but it'll be interesting. If editing is allowed, I think we'll for sure have to be able to show in the UI really quickly what the edits were. Which isn't my favorite, but people need to know because you can fuck with people really easily by editing posts. Alright, so yeah, we could do the indexes in this kind of a wrapper thing where even it maybe has aggregated information like upvote count, but the actual content is denormalized. We're pointing to the actual thing. Anti-gaslight technology. You gotta have it. Our social network has the latest in anti-gaslight technology. Zens. That's not bad. It's not bad. So let's see here. Now the thing about denormalizing here is that the performance characteristics are actually perhaps more extreme than in a normal relational database, because not only are we talking about cross database linkages here, but we're also talking about databases which are networked. And so if we are denormalizing like this, there's going to be a performance hit that may be a problem. On the flip side, though, copying the data out of a original source certainly invites some opportunity for nonsense to occur, and it involves having to manually update those indexes anytime any modification occurs. Well, I'm not really sure what I think about that yet, but maybe what we'll start with is the denormalized form, where you're pointing to have URLs pointing to the original, and that's how the indexes work. And then we will see how it performs. If it doesn't perform well enough, we will. Am I using that right? Denormalized versus normalized? I suppose. Well, forget it. I probably used that wrong, but we will either, if it's not performing well enough, we'll stop just linking to the original. We'll copy over all the data into the indexes. Post as a soapbox. So then we got to think about how these schemas are for the aggregated indexes here. Oh man, oh man. Let's just call it the featured feed, because that just kind of rings better to me. And I'm going to introduce a convention of IDX for secondary, for indexes, for tables that are indexes. What other indexes will we possibly want? Probably a votes index, probably a threads index, we may also want additional feed indexes, but for now I'm going to say, well, yeah, we might want. Another interesting question is, how will we be constructing a feed for the user? And, will it be the server, whenever it's constructing it, is it going to query each followed user's feed and then construct it from multiple different queries? It's a possibility. I have some performance concerns about that, but I suppose we'll start with that because that's the kind of naive, simple approach, and then we'll worry about performance if it becomes a problem. But I think this is a good start for our schemas. So why don't we go ahead and start defining these. And we'll start with user. And let's make our lives a little easier and do this in the shell here. So I'm just going to do a little quick typo. Alright. So the user, I'm going to have to be referring to the JSON schema documentation frequently here. as I recall, this is a pretty good. Yep, and good reference. And there's a field that I'm going to start with, which is something along the lines of descriptions. Where's that listing of the metadata? Under generic keywords. Yeah, annotations. Thanks, Jamie. Okay, so title and description. And good to fill out the descriptions because we will forget what these things are. So the user is a record, let's see, record of a user registered on a citizen server. And it has a username string, which is required. I'm not going to put descriptions on the individual fields unless I have to. Right, required is actually not on the individual fields, it goes right here. So we got the username and maybe the join date. And I'm going to do dates as strings that are, there's that standard kind of form that I can't think of the name of at the moment, but I'm going to try to use a standard string form of dates. And there may, at some point, we may add like roles, something like that, but for now, no. Let's jump up to account. Internal record of user account registrations. Oh, you know what else we need in our user, of course, is their URL. And we could apply some validation to that URL. We probably should, in fact. Let's see what we have. In fact, we should probably talk about it, validation in general here. So let's jump over to the string. So usernames, I think we're going to say have to be at least 3 characters long. And at most, let's say 64. And we should actually apply some validation on it with a regex. And this will be brutal to actually specify, people's the rules around allowed username characters. We don't want to make things hard for people who are not English speakers, but we also want to make sure that we're not allowing UTF-8 that can be problematic. So, oh boy, I'm thinking. For now, I'm going to take a naive approach. And then we're going to worry about the rest later. And I think, actually, if I'm doing it by a regex, I probably need to specify my size constraints there. And needs to start with, oh, you know what? Do we want to do case insensitive or not? That's an interesting question. I feel like probably yes, we do. We don't want somebody to be able to change the capital and then like screw with anybody. So I think perhaps, oh man. Well, no. Let's do a case insensitive, and then it's just going to be up to the servers to be careful about not allowing people to screw with that. You vote for case insensitive. So it'll be case insensitive in the handling, but really what I'm thinking about is whether or not the schema should enforce all lowercase. And I think the answer to that is a hard no. Also going to make it have to start with a character. Database URL is a little bit easier. Starts with hyper. And then it has a hex string that is 64 characters long. And a optional ending slash, and that's that. Actually, why don't we make that not optional so that there's predictability in the data output. And then the join date. Probably wise to put a regex on this as well, just to protect people from screw-ups. Let's take a look real quick and see how people normally do JSON schema dates. And if anybody in the chat has a perspective on this, feel free to offer. Not seeing anything. String format can definitely handle dates. Let me see if I can remember. So there's a... Is it the UTC string I'm thinking of? Yeah, I think that's how I want to have this stuff stored. Because I'm pretty sure that's or no, it's the ISO string I'm thinking of. Yeah, yes, because that's a pretty universal format for date times that should have support across multiple different ecosystems. And I believe it is showing. I believe it shows time zone information there. I'm not sure. Actually, I'm not sure. I'm not seeing anything that suggests that. Time zone is always 0 UTC offset is denoted by the Z suffix. Yeah, okay, that looks right, because 20 is not actually, it's 2:30 right now, which would be 14, so it's doing the time zone conversion in that encoding to the 0 UTC, or to the, 0 UTC offset, so that's good. So we just need a regex for that now, which I'm sure we could find. And why don't we test this before we just jump to it? Because I'm going to be copying and pasting this a lot and don't want to get that wrong. So looks at least compatible with that test, and that's good enough for me. What, you got a problem with that? Backslashes. Well, that's ugly. Surely that's... Let's see if that's... If there's any way to make that cleaner. Nope. Gotta do the double slashes. That's a shame. Boy, that ain't easy to look at, is it? That's a tough regex to be staring at. Okay. Cool. All right, now let's get into the account again. So first we're going to have the username. And then we're going to have their email address. And oh boy, now we get to do an email regex. Maybe we should... I may not do that. I may leave... Email regexes are infamously difficult. I may not actually enforce that at the schema level. This is a private database anyway. So I think I'm going to leave that alone. And for now, that's all we need in the account. Alright, now let's do a post here. Now we get to think about some... Yeah. Oh, is there format email? Jamie, you're crushing it. I should take a look real quick at what formats are there. Oh, they even have a date time. That looks like our format too. Perfect. Okay, good. Now we don't have that ugly. That ugly regex in there anymore. That's great. And then email. Now, what's the IDN email? In that international form. Let's see what draft we're on with AJV. Version 7. No, that's version 7 of it. Let's see what JSON schema it's using. Which draft? Supports draft 067-2019-9. I think the 9 is what we're looking for here because that tells us it's more than 7. So probably want to do IDN email. Okay. Definitely want to respect people not speaking English. Alright, what else we got here? We got host names, we got URLs, but we have a slightly different situation, so I'm not going to use that. JSON pointers. Probably good on that. Huh, should look into JSON pointers though. Might end up being useful in our design at some point, you never know. If we want to refer to individual fields inside of the objects. Alright, let's see here. So, okay, that's accounts done. Now let's hit post. And now we got a great question to ask ourselves, which is, how do we want to do rich text formatting in the posts? Do we want it at all? The pretty obvious choice would be to use Markdown. That's probably the safest bet. Gets us a lot out of the box. It's a well understood format. There's some things about using Markdown for social media posts that I don't love. For one, if we're talking about essentially what are tweets, and you're able to put like headers in there, that's pretty weird, and it tends to make for some pretty ugly feeds. But related to this, another question we got to ask ourselves is, do we have a character limit on these posts? So chat, what are your thoughts? Do we put character limits on posts? I'm leaning towards yes. If so, are they short or are they long? And then are we going to have Markdown support? I'm kind of inclined to actually do short posts, similar to what Twitter does. If we want to have, let me share some experience about this. I must have built a billion of these damn things. I've made so many versions of social media apps. And one of the first ones I worked on was Secure Scuttlebutt. And we did actually have a limit on the length of post, but it was actually a protocol level constraint. Basically, every message had a maximum size. That ended up determining it, but it was like, something around like 65,000 characters. And I gotta be honest, it's somebody described it once as full contact blog hockey. Because what you get when you get long posts, I know that it's the logic that JMax is putting out here, less hot takes, more long takes. There's a lot of logic to that. But sometimes having a constraint on how long somebody can go really helps keep the conversation moving. You end up in situations where people are just giving these long spiels where they're not editing themselves down, and you're having to put in a lot of mental energy to engage in the community. And I don't know, it's a tough decision about whether or not our goal here is to have kind of longer, more in-depth conversation or not. Now, maybe one angle to take is that we don't, that we have a longer comments but shorter posts. That's certainly an option. Something else to consider is when you do allow for long posts, you then get into the really tedious UI work of, shortening the post whenever it is long. And that UI work actually super sucks. And part of what we're trying to do here is make the network flexible enough that people are able to build their own applications against it, make their own versions of how all this should work. And so part of me is kind of like, I don't know if I want to, it might be nice to put constraints in like that so that actually building applications is less of a pain. There's also the possibility of creating like post variations over time, which do have longer character limits. So I'm sort of inclined to actually put in a character limit, and I'm inclined to say it should be 256 characters. Now, one other thing to consider on this, though, is how Markdown factors in. Because if we're using rich text formatting like Markdown, now you got to think about how the syntax of Markdown is eating characters on you. And that's actually kind of a problem. And that is a pretty strong strike against using Markdown, certainly if we're going to have character limits. We might be better off using a system where any kind of rich text is done by annotations which are stored outside of the source material, where you're specifying ranges of like characters from 5 to 10 should be bold. That's something that I've seen some pretty smart people do. I think it was, I want to say Bloomberg. Some of the engineers at Bloomberg worked on something that did it that way for all their sort of CMS. So I'm kind of more inclined to do it that way. Then we also get a little more control about what rich text formatting options there are. So I'm going to go with that. And I'm going to say max length of 256 characters. Yeah, having different types of posts will probably be where this heads. Probably need a min length of at least one character. We got our created at. What else do we need here? We could add an updated at. I don't know. Maybe not. So Sully is suggesting a node, a character limit that's sort of chosen by the instance. Problem with that is that the data schema agreement across multiple instances ends up being a pretty important challenge because your software, when you're interacting with content being pulled from the broader network, agreement about what to expect about the constraints on the schemas is really important. In fact, that's why we're doing these schemas. So I appreciate the logic of it, but I think actually that may invite more complexity than it's worth. Repost versus original post. Let's worry about repost later. We'll extend the schema to add it. Cat wants in, so I will BRB. Time for the cat action. Gonna wave to everybody. Mike says duplicate meta field that includes extra characters from Markdown, URLs, etc. Yeah, so we will specify how to do rich text annotations in a second. Probably another day of the stream. Not gonna worry about that. So all right, let's just say we're done. Move on to the next thing. Let's do comments next. Comments are going to be similar to posts, so let's jump over here. So Jerry asked, you already did a Twitter clone for Beaker browser, right? Can you give some insight about how this app is different from the previous one? The one that we did in Beaker is where we're drawing a lot of our front-end code from. And the way that was designed was, it was set up to run entirely inside of the Beaker browser, whereas this one is a federated peer-to-peer hybrid. And so you're going to be accessing the network through the servers, through the federated servers. And so it's kind of a pure peer-to-peer versus federation design. And one of the major motivations for that is to make it so that people even that don't use Beaker can use it. And in the Beaker version, the way it was designed is that there was actually an aggregating indexer that was baked into the back end of the browser. And it would actually go out and pull down the content from people you were following and then produce a SQLite database internally which you could query. And basically that logic is now going to be moved into the federated servers, which is in many ways much better because we were super uncomfortable with putting that kind of opinionation into the browser platform itself. It may be a good idea at some point, but if we're going to do something like that, we got to feel really sure about the technology and the kind of APIs we're putting in, and we really it was a little too YOLO. So, all right, now we got comments. Comments are technically unconstrained about what they can be commenting on. You have the subject URL, which is going to be a type string, and let's take a quick look at what the URI validation does, because we want it to be URI. And I suppose the question is, like, is it going to validate on hyper URLs? Let's sort of say YOLO yes, and then find out later if it doesn't. You got the text of the comment, you got the created at, and then you got the parent comment URL, because we're going to have threading. The text of the comment. This is actually an interesting question too. I was saying earlier that the comments could be of any length, but that's another thing where like UI design really gets affected by this sort of thing. You know, let's say for now that comments can be significantly longer. I mean, the question is, like, do we want the comments to be like Reddit and Hacker News, or do we want them to be like Twitter? I think people tend to like threaded comments like Reddit and Hacker News, so I'm sort of inclined to do that. Cat's making a fuss. So let's go ahead and hi white paper cat, thanks. Let's say what should our limit be here? Let's make it long. I don't know, 10,000, 100,000. Let's say 100,000. And I think for now that's our comment schema. Let's do the vote next. Comment is longer than post. Does that seem weird? The UI is pretty different between the two, you know. You got the feed, and we're doing a Twitter style of application here, so you got the feed with the posts, and then the question is like, the comments, is it like when you go into the comments, it's threaded, and it looks more like Reddit? And if it is, then, you know, you can have them be longer. But if we're wanting to do it to be really similar to Twitter, they should be the same length as the posts, because perhaps the comments are also getting, if we have an equivalent of retweets, they're also getting put onto the feed. The thing about this is, I know there are criticisms about the form of Twitter, but I'm actually a pretty big fan of Twitter personally, so I kind of am inclined to mimic the parts of Twitter that I personally like, and I like the character limits on both the tweets and the reply tweets. So you gotta be careful not to try to be everything to everybody, and I'm inclined to not do that and actually shorten the comments too. Yeah, I think Jerry's got a point. I think let's just do it uniformly for now, and then if people ever get their pitchforks out, we can reevaluate. So on a vote, you got the subject, the URL of the subject, and then you got the vote value. That'll be a number. And it's either going, let's see, so now we need to be able to say what possible values the number can be, which is like an enum thing. Yep. -1 for a downvote, 1 for an upvote. I'm thinking we're going to do upvotes and downvotes, or at least the schema will support it. Well, if the schema supports it, it's what we're doing. So now that's an interesting question as well. Are we doing likes, or are we doing upvotes and downvotes? I always kind of felt like downvotes should be a part of this stuff. I understand that there's a negativity to downvotes, and I suppose you could always, you know, set up a given instance to, yeah, you know, you can always remove it from a given instance. They do that on Reddit, and it doesn't screw with anything too heavy. Let's go ahead and say upvotes and downvotes. I feel like if you don't have downvotes, you're actually taking away an ability for the users, the community, to kind of self-define. I think you need to have a way for people to be able to say what's not fitting for their community. All right, so we got accounts, we got comments. Let's do follows. For the moment, we're just going to have the URL of who they're following, I think. We could add probably should do created at. In fact, we may need to add created at to a couple of things that we just did. Probably need that on comments. Get it? Comments got it. Votes probably need it. All right. Let's do profiles now. Maybe there should be a TTY for posts. What do you mean TTY? Let's see now. Are there any of these features of a time to live? So TTL, time to live, like a way for posts to expire? That's an interesting idea. It's certainly novel. Seems a little bit out of the scope, I think, of what we're trying to accomplish here. I'm not looking to innovate on that particular space. Matthew asks, are any of these features of a typical centralized social network that might not survive the trip into the D-Web? Do you have any ideas in particular, any feature in mind that might not survive? One of the things we're doing here is establishing this system of schemas which are put at URLs. They will actually be enforcing a consensus in the network, even though it's decentralized, about the shape of the data. And that'll actually have quite a bit of effect on how decentralized the software is. It sort of forces a consensus on the model. I think that's actually an important social element to bring into the system. Because we're having these things, we can actually put data, constraints on the data like we're doing here. What else we need to do is go back through all these and specify which of the fields are required, which most of them are. So profile. What kind of information do we want to put in profiles? You got your name and your bio, and we got to talk in a second about how names are going to function. User display names. It's a good point, display name. We're going to come back to avatar when we get into how to deal with media in general. Other links, that's a good one. So we'll just do homepage URL. No, I'm not thinking like Gravatar. I'm thinking more like our data model currently, we don't have a way, we haven't spec'd out how to put binary data into our databases yet. I suppose we could do a generic links system where it's not more than just a single one, but I'm a little disinclined to add complexity like that. Hey Clayton, thanks for joining. Glad to have you. Display name, we need to do display name. Could authors self-host their avatar? That'll be the idea. I mean, they'll be hosted. So every user is operating off of a peer-to-peer database, and the idea is that they can either have that database be maintained by their server, or they can bring it to the server, and if they're using Beaker. It's going to be a little bit of complexity around that to figure out, and we're going to have to weigh against how much value that really brings. But the idea is we should have a clean and simple way for you to move a account from one instance to another. But it's a complicated thing. You want to be able to carry over things like your social follows and maybe your posts as well. But if you're in a new community that has different rules around moderation, and you suddenly show up with a bunch of posts that are now populating that feed, that's an interesting question about how to deal with that. So it may not be that you actually take your database and just re-home it. It may be that you create a copy instead. We'll have to think heavily about that when we get there. All right, so we got to think about constraints. So the description is optional. So it should have a max length, and let's set that to 256 characters. Let's grab our username rules. We're duplicating the username here, which could end up with disagreements between the server and the user. Hey Math, welcome to the stream. Matthias is the protocol lead on Hypercore protocol, the technology we're using. Jerry's saying he doesn't like the idea of the copying the database. It's going to just have to be a technical decision at the end of the day, but the end effect should be the same. The question is simply what information can you transfer out of an instance cleanly. And it may be simpler to just spawn a new database at the new instance and copy over your information, as opposed to which should have more or less the exact same results. It's if the protocol is designed. You might need to leave a forwarding address. We'll have to come up with a protocol around that. Math is blowing off his protocol work by hanging out here. Next version of Hypercore now delayed 6 more months. So we got the... Here's a question about whether or not we ought to have the username in 2 places. Should it be in both the user database and in the server database? They could end up disagreeing, and that's not great. So I'm going to say no, I think, for now. And then we got to decide... I just got to work faster. Now we got to decide what's valid here. This can be definitely looser than usernames by a significant amount. How many people, as a rough guess, you think are working on the peer-to-peer programming scene? If I had to give a rough guess, I'd say about 100. Maybe, it depends on if you're talking like working on protocols or building externally. If you're talking about, you know, building externally, it probably widens to maybe 1,000, 5,000. Still a young space. So the display name can be 1 character. It can be A through Z. Honestly, it can be a lot of things. So I need a regex here that... Maybe we're just not going to put a regex on this for now. I take your point, Jerry. It's going to be a balancing act. We'll hopefully cook up something that works well, but it's just at the stage at this point that I can't really definitively say how that should function. Now here's something that just sort of occurred to me. There's the question about required properties. Well, there's another question to bring in about whether or not we allow properties that are not defined in the spec. Now, an argument in favor of allowing added properties is that you're introducing more extensibility to the schema. The problem with that is that if you allow that and then the schema changes, you add fields, you might end up conflicting by taking some of the field names that somebody had used without consulting with you. So I think we actually need to have a strict requirement that you can only use the properties that are in the schema definition. And I believe there is a field for doing that. Additional properties. If it's set to false, no more can be set. I agree, it's not many, but I think it will grow. Yeah, JSON schema. Yeah, Lars, you should check out the repo. I'll put another link in here to see how we're designing this. I think we got something pretty cool cooked up for the schemas here. Oh, that's not, I missed the N. Well, sorry about that. Click that, add an N to the end, and you'll find the repo. That's not helpful. Okay, so I think we basically have defined everything about our indexes now. So let's get into the indexes. Let's start with the vote IDX. For now, I'm sort of inclined, you know, we could also create an index of who did the upvoting. That might be wise. But we'll worry about that at another time. Now let's do the thread index. A thread index, this one will be interesting here. So how do we want to do this? So one option is to I think probably actually what we need to, all we need in this index is there's a couple of questions on my mind here. One of them is how this is going to be working. I mean, all that we really need is the subject URL and then an array of URLs to the comments. So I think that's how we're going to do this. There is a missing in on the link. Yeah, sorry about that. I think that's all we need there. And I'm going to rename this to the comments IDX. Okay, so that's the comment IDX, and finally we add the featured post index. And so that's going to be We're going to do this with linking for the moment. So you have a URL for the post. And I think for the moment that's all we need. Now a lot of these schemas may end up changing over time. It's a real good chance of that. As always happens, you know, your database model evolves as you build. And so there are definitely aspects of all of this which we may modify over time. And you know what I think is time for? It's time to register a domain name for our schemas here. So let's see what's available here. I think last I saw citizen.network. So Matthias is asking about writing the schemas themselves to the peer-to-peer database also. No, I'm actually hosting them on HTTPS at the moment so that they look like that. And the reason I did that is that because we don't have DNS and hypercore right now, and I feel like we're inviting a whole lot of risk by having the public keys being used to identify the schemas. Not only is it kind of a crummy developer experience because we use these schemas to identify the tables, but I just, you know, what happens when your schema definition and you lose the private key, that would be pretty rough. So I'm sort of inclined to use HTTPS for now. Now, that said, it can be any URL. So once we get DNS and hyper, you could always switch over. But I'm gonna stick with HTTPS for this. And let's see if all right, I got a winner here. I think I'm going to do citizen.network to host our schemas. Okay, citizen.network is registered. Why not store schemas inside the app itself? We definitely can. Basically, the question is just kind of like, how do we map for a given schema URL to the actual schema definition? The way that I've designed it currently is you actually fetch it from the URL at load time when the server starts. And then perhaps it would periodically refetch to refresh and make sure it's catching any updates. Or maybe it would be by command. We'll have to kind of sort that out. Alternatively, you could have the schema. I mean, the schemas, as you can see, are being defined inside of this repo. And so you could always refer to the local versions and just map. And that actually is how the code currently operates. So there will always be a debug mode to pull from the internal indexes. The internal schemas. Doesn't really matter either way. The thing that matters most is just having everybody have consensus about the schema definitions. You don't want to screw that up. This is tedious. If you wanted to step away for half a second, go ahead, because as soon as I'm done here, I'm going to go grab myself another drink. That way we'll kick back in. It's BRB. Okay. So now we got our schemas outlined. What next? Okay. Balls of hair to break down. Probably the next thing we ought to do here. Well, I'll go ahead and answer this question. Jerry's bringing it up. He's saying there won't be strict consensus in every point in time. Of course, that's true. An app might be used in an offline setting and then synced. If the schema was updated within that time, the data will become invalid on syncing. Now, that's correct. Except, well, it's correct flat out. The mitigating factor there is that because of what you just described, and for many other reasons, it's incumbent on the schema designers to make sure that they don't make backwards incompatible changes to the schema. That's the trick. So in a context like you're saying, there should never be a situation where the schema changes, you come online, and suddenly your database is invalid. And it's just going to require the schema designers to be aware of what they're doing and careful about changes they make to the schemas. Okay, so no. It's kind of hard to see. Okay, here we go. I want to close everything but this. And why don't we, no, I'm not going to save you. Why don't we jump over to our database? I think probably the next thing to do now is to get the user database mechanisms done and start writing some web APIs for, or at least some tools to get user registration, user creation handled. And then we can sort of develop out our APIs, and let's perhaps aim for basically getting all of a first pass on all of the web APIs done, or the RPC APIs done, so that we can then start to work on the front end. So we're going to need to nuke our old databases here, since they have old debug schemas in them. And then I'm thinking on the public, on the servers, we'll probably just have them load up their tables rather than us always fetching them. So during their setup, that'll happen. So let's go over to our base database, yeah, and then on database created. Actually, we don't need to do that. So, public, we got user table, which would be await this.get table. Matthew's asking, how would user-generated content hosted in my personal drive be included in the social network if the server schema changes? Would the site be required to have schema version specific UI logic? We may need to introduce versions into the schemas themselves, but again, they're not supposed to have breaking changes. And so it should be possible to, it shouldn't be a problem as long as we don't break schemas. We will sort of feel that out as we go, but if you produce data, so as long as the schema is being correctly managed by the schema maintainers, which for Citizen that'll be me, and whatever organization rises around it, as long as they don't screw anything up, then it will be incumbent on anybody participating in the network to follow the schemas correctly. Otherwise, their content will not carry through the network. That got renamed to comment index. Okay, and then the private one just has one table, which is the accounts table. And now let's define the user database, which will be similar here. We don't need to log when that happens. As a server operator, would it be schema validation that would determine which drives and their compatible content I mirror? It will have a huge bearing. I mean, when you get into a situation like peer-to-peer situation where topology is much freer, you're no longer defined by the walled garden of a given server since you're pulling from a wider network. You're really defined by schema compatibility. That is, by and large, what defines the scope of your network. By the way, in the design we're doing here, we're actually not going to be using hyperdrives like we have in the past. We're going to use Hyper-Bs, which are key value databases similar to LevelDB. Okay, so I'm just going to speed things up by doing a little copy-paste magic here. Right. Okay. Let's see if everything is in working order here. And we can do that by doing, why don't we create an account for me? How's that going to work? Let's see here. And then let's see, homepage URL, and we'll just leave that off for now. Okay, and then we can just make sure it reads out correctly. mad guy. I was going to put a mad scientist since we had the whole mad science theme, and then I realized that's really pretentious. So I'm not doing that. Alright, so then we're going to do await public server db.users.put phrasey. And we're going to add a getter on here to get the URL of the database. And this key.toString hex. And we'll put that inside of like that. And so then I will put username, DB, URL, and join date. DB URL, which would be the phrasey.url, and then join date, which will be new date.toISOstring. And we'll make sure that wrote correctly. And then we're going to add the account entry. So that's in the private server database. We actually don't need the username here, I don't think, because that will be the key name. And here we just put the URL, the email. I don't care if y'all know it. I share it widely. Okay, let's see if that worked. Well, that's not good. Okay, so it failed to read our database config because I nuked it, but it should be responding to it not found by just creating it. So let's see here. No int. Need to update our schemas mapper here to be mapping citizen.network to the local node. Okay, what else we getting here? Can't read property put of undefined. Yep. I forgot to run setup on the user database. Let's try again. Okay, interesting. So it doesn't know the URI format. Let's see why that might be. Looks like we need to install the AJV formats plugin. Okay. No bigs. Try again. Can't find that package. Typo. Yep, y'all are faster than me. All right, now what we got? Can't read property put of undefined. So it's upset about something here. Let's see. Now, why would this be happening here? So, it seems like the tables aren't getting created for us. Let's see if that's also the case on the public server, DB. Also seems to be the case there. So let's take a look. Oh, that's not what I want. On database created is when it's actually a new database, and I need to call this on every setup. So let's do that by wrapping the setup call. So it'll be like that. Can't read property of undefined. We're looking at line 6, so get table is just failing. Can't read ID. Line 67. Unknown format IDN email. Guess that's not supported here. Well, this may be slobbish, but I'm just going to do the normal email validator then. We'll worry about that later. Something wrong with our validation when we're loading, so let's see what that is. Type, oh, how'd that happen? So when we did our put, it needs to be table_def.value. So now our Hyper-Bs are screwed up, so we'll have to nuke them. Try again. Alright. We mostly made it, but I'm failing validation on the accounts put. Did I not? Forgot to remove the required field there. We are almost in business. Let's remove some of the excess logs and try one more time. Okay. So that's good. It's time for some music, which I can't play on the stream, of course, so gotta put on my headphones. So now what we got to be thinking about is having a process to, when during setup, to then go through each of the registered users and load up their user DBs into memory so that they're actively syncing and being seeded. All right, so why don't we go ahead and commit what we got here. I'm going to remove this debug code before we commit. And then we're going to want a user DBs listing, which probably ought to actually be a map. And we're going to export a function to create user. And that'll be this logic here. And we'll have that all set so you can get the user databases from that. And then we just need the non-exported async load user DBs. If you're gonna listen to music, you actually have to start it. Okay. So next up, I'm gonna go back to our base here, and we got I'm going to add a helper function, which is a list function, which just saves us from having to work with streams in all cases. I don't always need to, so I'm going to do pretty simple. And then and the over here, our loader, we'll do let users equals await public server database dot list. Not dot list, it'll be dot users dot list. I believe user is where we're putting the DB URL. It is. And we'll start by just logging that. Probably we'll see just one entry there for my account that I created. There it is. Good deal. So now we will iterate through them. And we're going to need to extract the key. So let's go ahead and create a lib directory here. we're going to define a hyperkey regex, which will be like that. And we'll let matches equals that dot exec on the string. And we should, I believe that's correct. Let's find out real quick. Okay, so then we just need to do a buffer.from on that. Yeah, pretty sure I want to do that. Good deal. Okay, so I can now import that. What the hell, just call it hyperkey. And then there we go there. Then over here we'll do that, and it'll be user.db URL, except it's going to be user.value.db URL. And we'll await the setup. Add to our map. Userdbs.set. User.key, so their username. And the userdb. Alright, that should handle that. Good deal. Yeah. Cool. And we'll go ahead and log when that happens. Loading. Let's not do that done output. That's all we need. All right. Now let's get this create user bit done. And we will need a username and description. Well, we'll just call that profile. That'll be an object. And what else do we need here? We need their email. All right, let's look at each of these records and see if that's everything. So the profile will be an object. There's account, which is just email. There's user, which is username, DB, URL, join date. That all looks right. And then profile. Okay. And we're going to actually need to run validation ahead of actually doing the puts to make sure that we're not half producing the records. We're also going to need to introduce some locking into the system so that concurrent writes don't conflict with each other. Need to have some transactionality. So let's see how to grab our schemas. So we got this right here. So we'll just fetch it, and when you call fetch, it's going to return the schema object with a validate function. And when we've used that, it's been over here. Why don't we move some of this validation code into the schemas area, because we're going to be using that a lot. And so it'll be, we'll move this validation error into the schemas. And then we're going to take this definition here and move it over here. Validate, and we'll call it assert valid. That kind of infers that it'll throw if it's not passing validation. So that seems like the right name for it. And let me change up my music real quick. Okay. And then we'll go back over to where we pulled this out, and we'll just replace all of these with this dot schema dot assert valid. And then what next? We go back over to what we were working on. That's an interesting thought, Andrew. I'm basically doing it manually by just, wrapping. So in this, wrapping the Hyper-V and doing it manually prior to the puts and what have you. And there's maybe some complexity around it because we actually have to validate it on read as well as on write. So doing it as the abstract encoding, well, I suppose it could that would apply there as well. It's a nice thought. We could always do it. Don't know if I need to spend the time yet. So now we need to import schemas. And we're going to validate each of these, which would be await schemas dot fetch and then that will be and now we have to decide, I guess we just go ahead and optimistically create the database. Hopefully that won't screw with us in any meaningful way. Be creating excess databases, validation could fail and it'd be unused. I don't know if that's a huge deal. I guess one other thing we could do is just put in a fake URL here. That might be wiser, to be honest. And then overwrite it. So we'll do that actually instead, because I'm actually not loving the idea of having unused unused databases, collecting cruft. And so I'll just do 0.repeat 64 times. Okay, we assert they're valid, that's all good, and then we do profile.db URL equals db.url. And then we, not on the profile, on the user. And then we write our records. So on the user, we public server db dot users dot put at the username. We put the user record. I'm messing with myself here. That should be user. And then finally in the private server db, we put in the accounts at the username, the account record. And then the last thing we do is we save in our map. And then we return. Well, I appreciate that, Lars. There's one other thing we need here, and that is to get the locks involved so we can have transactionality. So I'm going to install something called a wait lock. So Jerry, Jerry's raising a good point here. Account, user, and profile, they all look like a single type of data named differently. User and profile might be merged entirely. So I'm in agreement that they are sort of semantic. Obviously, it confused me as I was working there, right? So that's not great. The reason that I'm doing it that way, why am I doing it that way? So it has to do with which databases to put into. You know, we're putting into different databases each time. The user is declaring its own profile and it's maintaining that. The server is mapping the username to the database and then storing the join date. So that's server authority. And then the private database on the server is maintaining the account information that shouldn't be shared widely. So that's why it's split up that way. And I do agree that it's a little similar words, but I think that they are accurate words for what's being used. So despite the slight confusion, I think I'm going to roll with that. And I've got some lock code that I use a lot that I'm going to grab now. It's a pretty simple interface where basically you get you can kind of guard a section with a weighted lock. So we'll see how that works and as I use it here. And does that exports a default function. Let's rename that to just lock. New module. Well, you don't like just copying and pasting code around? That's the new way to do things. Everybody's doing it. So we're not going to catch, but we are going to do a finally. So that the lock always gets released. And now we have the interesting question about what lock we're going to be using here. I'm just going to do a total database lock. So anything else that's transactional that hits that code path like this, we'll do a total lock around the servers, all the servers' databases if it uses that ID for the lock. Again, for better or for worse. Well, we can always refine that. Okay, cool. So now we got a create user function. And we got our users loading. So that's a lot handled there. I think we're actually getting pretty close to being able to start to spec the RPC APIs. So an interesting question about the RPC APIs is like, how do we want to define those? And to some degree, we could always just do a generic. Oh, you know what I didn't include? A password. That needs to be in the account record in the private database. We'll get there when we get there. But anyway, so we should be able to actually. I don't think there would be any serious risk to. We'll see. But any serious risk to the RPC APIs being a pretty clear pass-through to the database methods. Like, there's going to have to be some amount of wrapping where it's, you know, limiting what you're allowed to access to be sure. So access control will need to be in there. Certainly, you're not going to allow phrasey to put to Andrew Osh's account. So there'll have to be some kind of permissioning management around the APIs. But otherwise, it should be... I'm thinking basically exposing, you know, put, post, get post, list posts, that kind of thing. And then just passing through to the database, which will make it a nice generic API. Should work. All right. This has been a unique project for me in that, like, every time I'm embarking on a new step in the project, I have to kind of, like, get my head there. I suppose normally if I was working alone, I'd walk away for a little bit, pace around, and then sit back down, but I don't want to make y'all have to wait. So let's start diving into these RPC APIs. So we got our WebSocket server here, and we need to register the methods on it. And it would be nice if we had a REPL for interacting with these, but I suppose we can just set up the front page and do it in the dev tools. So now I guess let's spec our APIs. Let's jump over to our sort of scratch sheet here. All right, so let's get some separators involved so we can kind of tell when we're moving from one thing to another. Don't need that anymore. So, all right, you're gonna have. Actually, I suppose it's not always gonna be a pass-through because there's different kinds of aggregation and things that'll have to be done. So let's spec some APIs. We're gonna post.list, post.get, post.put, post.delete. We're gonna have users.get and I suppose we're going to need some kind of registration stuff, but we'll deal with that later. We're going to have the comments API. It's going to be the votes API. And these will change, but I'm just going to lay them all out. What else are we going to have? Well, there's going to be accounts, register. There's some kind of facility in our RPC API module that we're importing for authentication, so we're going to have to look at that before we decide what to do there. Probably an unregister. And we'll deal with have to think through the flows around that when we get there. There's posts, users, comments, votes, what are our other schemas here? Following. And that's, okay, that's our starting point here. So users.get looks about right. That's just going to give you their profile info. Probably we do need a way to modify the profile, so that would be something like profiles.put. Should profiles.get be separate from users.get? Have it mapped to the schemas more cleanly. I suppose we can decide that later. For posts, it's going to be things like list the featured posts. You're going to want list user post and list. Yeah. There's going to be post.list list my feed. Let's call it feed. That all seems right. Now, I guess one thing we might want to do is differentiate between creating and modifying. On comments, you're going to want list thread. Same story, create and edit. On votes, you're going to want to get a user feed of votes, probably. Yeah, let's say yes. We'll futz with that as we get there. There's going to be not often that you're going to be getting an individual vote so much as you're going to be getting the votes on an individual item. So let's do get, let's see, it's not listing and it's not getting, because a get sort of suggests you're getting an individual vote, but we're talking about like for a given subject URL. It's like aggregate, like get subject votes, get votes for subject. It's a little clunky, but we'll take it. Put and delete seem right for votes because it's as opposed to create and edit. Follows will be, it could be votes.count. Let's do count for subject. But it's not quite just a number coming out. We'll do get votes for content. So then follows, it's going to be list followers, list follows. It's going to be, I guess you could have a get, yeah. And we'll do follows.follow and follows.unfollow for those semantics. This all seems correct. Naming things is always hard. Alright, this seems right. I might actually save this because it's kind of a handy thing to be able to refer back to. I will probably rename later. Okay, so now we need an APIs folder. We already have one. And let's separate these by their different namespaces. So we got accounts, we got users, we got profiles, we got posts, comments. Now, actually, one thing we ought to ask ourselves is whether or not, since posts and comments are really functionally similar. No, we're leaving it. They're separate. We got follows and votes. All right, let's see if we got everything. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. All right, and let's just paste these in here to remind ourselves what each of them are supposed to have. All right, so that's all those. Now we need to figure out how these are going to be defined. And we'll start with users. And what is that module we were using here? It's RPC WebSockets. Alright, I'm going to close some of these. And this has this register function. So probably it'll be something like, we'll need an index for this, I think, to some, yeah. And each of these will probably need to export something like a setup function, where it takes in the server and then calls these registers on them. As you asked, how can I get started developing? How can I get started developing with Hyperdrive? Go to the website that I'm about to link you there, and you'll find a lot of starting information. That should get you going. Okay, so let's start by seeing if I can do that action, accounts.register. We might want to wrap this with something a little more convenient, but maybe not. And it's going to return, right? So we'll just do return to do. Same with unregister. Oh, I appreciate you following. And everybody at their own pace. No rush or anything. But okay, and so now what we need to do is take a look at what our front end is doing and make sure that we've got our RPC API available. Alright, so we'll do import okay, well, let's see if we're in business here. Huh. Ah, it's not async. And actually I want to call it den, not index. Okay, I need to run our build step, which alright, and it's complaint a type to query is not defined. Now why is that happening? Didn't I get all those? Let's see. Oh no, I didn't. Yeah, that's... Let's see. In fact, it's right at the top. That's no good. Okay, complaining about some not founds. That's no big deal. Now, what is this illegal, an invalid or illegal string was specified? You gotta take me to the code? Come on. That's sort of odd. May have to actually switch over to Chrome to get some better dev tools. Sorry to say it, but for instance, shouldn't it be breaking? Or taking me to the thing when I click on it. Okay, well, sorry. Sorry, Firefox, but now we're just frozen. So, you're going in the timeout corner. My computer may be suffering a little bit. We're definitely maxing its resources by streaming. And I'm sure opening up another browser will only worsen the situation. Stabilizing? Looks like it. So I'm going to bring over all my tabs. All right. Okay. So that needs to be AWS, and I need to run the build. I need to get a watcher going on the front end assets. Okay. So despite all those errors, okay, I just got a method not found. Who's trying to? Do I have some debug code still? That's not very helpful. Let's see. It's incredibly unhelpful. What's the deal? Who's even trying to call? The stack is not being preserved, so I can't even tell. Well, do we have the API object? We do. So let's... Can't call register of undefined. Okay. So our API definition is using this proxy, and it's not currently smart enough to have sub-objects, but I feel like sub-objects should be a part of this. In fact, I feel, yeah, so probably the first, it'll be a proxy which returns objects, well, sub-proxies really, which can then be used to call methods. So that will change this right here, where it'll be should actually be, we'll do prop2, and it'll be prop.prop2. JMax, hit me with your question. What's up? So, you know, the hyperstack got started way before WASM. So, oh, it's a promise. And the important sorry, here I'm just eventually I imagine a lot of the stack will get rewritten as, well, just the pieces that are needed at least. So yeah, if we can do it in Rust, that'd be great. It's not something I'm focused on or a part of at the moment, so, you know, And also something to consider about the, okay, method not found. Something to consider about all that is simply the question about the WASM environment, which I think you'd have to build out to the host environment to be able to run the WASM code. And so it would not be, I don't know about doing a Rust build of the hyperstack to run in WASM. I think if you do that, you'd want to actually run it as native code. I mean, you might be, depends on what you're doing, but. So that method not found, probably because we're not calling the accounts API setup here. So let's do that. Of course, it actually shouldn't be async. You too, thanks for joining us. Okay. We have some code that's not releasing the thread. Oh no. Wonder when that happened. Oh, I know when that happened. Shoot. Die. Is it gonna respect nope, that's the same thing. Command Z? I don't even know what that does. Oh, well that's just gonna background it. Oh, though, maybe backgrounding it then allows me to... No? No, backgrounding, of course, that's not enough. I think I'll need to get the activity manager involved. It's probably not a good sign that the thing, is this, it should respond to the double command, control C, so that's not good. And I don't suppose to end of line. Nope, alright. Kill -9. Oh shoot, I closed that tab. Did I get it? Activity manager is making this thing struggle. I think that got it. Yeah, okay. Kill -9. That is tiny. Okay, where was I? Okay, I need to fix that problem. And the problem there was that in our databases, our teardown. Huh. Actually, I'm not sure what was failing the cleanup. Something was not getting done. There's some active process. So we're going to have to come back to that. Because I don't want to... I don't really want to get stuck on that at the moment. Okay, let's try this again. Okay, it worked. Good. All right, so let's get the other ones scaffolded out. Wait a minute, is the spread what I want? I'm getting an array passed in, so I don't think that's going to work. I think I just need to accept that it's like that. Yeah, that's handy. I just needed to get the -9 involved. Almost there. Okay, now in our index, we just gotta import each of these stupid things and call out to the setup. Kind of a pain, but I don't really know a much better way to do this. Okay, so now we have all of our RPC APIs scaffolded out. So API.post. Let's see. Post.list featured feed. Let's just make sure that works. Yep, all right. So far, so good. Now, why is this thing acting like params is getting used? I'm going to choose not to worry about that, but that's sort of odd. It should be dimmed like the other ones. Alright, going to give myself half a second break to just check what's going on in the world here. Okay. Cool. Okay. Oh, man. How long's the stream been going so far? We started, what, 2:30? So we're at 2 hours now? Started at 2-ish, so 2.5 hours. Okay. I was actually hanging out with my family last night and up till 4:30 around the fire pit. I'm as shocked as anybody that I'm actually even able to do anything. I'm glad I can, because I'm excited about this project and excited to get to the point that it's in a working shape. So now what? I guess we got to start defining some of these APIs, eh? And yep, that's probably about right. How often do I anticipate I'll stream this project? My plan is for the foreseeable future until, you know, we kind of get to something approaching a V1 and maybe beyond that. But for the foreseeable future, I'm going to stream all my work on it. Just figured that'd be a fun way to do this. You know, not often that you get such a well-scoped sort of side project to do like this. And it will, so probably going to be doing this about daily or close for a couple of weeks now. And I'm actually hoping that we can get MVP of this thing done by the end of next week, which would be pretty exciting. And in fact, I think we may by middle of next week be close to it. So we'll just see how it goes and see how much juice I got. And if you never want to miss a stream, of course, smash that subscribe button. Subscribing to me on YouTube, you'll get a consistent update on it. Nish is asking how Uplink's progress is. And almost true to form, we pressed the pause button on it because we wanted to first work on the Hive command line. And now we're still leaving it paused because we want to try this experiment out. So, what time do I normally start? I might actually, you know, it depends. My usual workday, I'll start same as anybody. So I think I'll probably just stream my workday as opposed to like trying to fit when I work around when's the ideal time to stream. So maybe starting like 11, 10 a.m. Central so on some days. So yeah, I'll just stream whenever I'm doing something. I like having y'all here with it. It's a really fun way to build. Well, all the streams are archived, so you can always jump on my YouTube page and should be able to find all of them. If not, let me know and I'll do what I need to do to fix that. But you should be able to get to all of them. And I'll keep calling it this, you know, Decentralized Social Media Project and just add day 3, day 4, day 5. Oh yeah, we're still alive, Kai. But I don't know how much longer. My brain is starting to feel a little bit of hangover. Breathe, man, breathe. Definitely want to get this thing out soon because I feel like the timing is very interesting, so definitely aiming for something next week. Alright. Evaluating if I got the juice. Oh, that's nice, yeah, Kai. Well, I won't go that big with it, but I hope it'll be interesting to folks. Yeah, you know what? I think I may be out of juice. I think I'm going to call it. So, as always, thanks y'all for joining me. This is on GitHub. There will be more days in the future, Kai. We will keep doing this. It is on GitHub. I'll link the repo here real quick. And why don't I go ahead and commit where we left off here. I may need to split this up into 2 commits. So it's going to be lib and db package and index. So the validation changes. We go ahead and hit all the database stuff first. Yeah. No to that. No to that. Yes to that. Happy New Year to you too. Yeah, looking forward to doing this. So definitely hope I'll see y'all in the next ones. I'm just going to do these commits and then I'll hit the end button. So first one is, what did we do with this? This was adding the user databases. And then add RPC API skeleton. Okay. See y'all next time, probably tomorrow. So see y'all on the next one. Thanks for joining me. Enjoy your Saturday night. And have a good week. No, weekend. Later.